Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mats Urglod. So I guess I could have recorded the intro with what I just said, because I think it leads into the conversation today. There's been a lot of activity, and Kai, you're saying that it's getting very busy all over the place. I think a lot, especially, well, not only in Europe, but especially in the European market where you both are sitting, there's a lot of movement due to some of the movements of the European Union, and then every nation state is investing in different projects. There's these large-scale pilots happening. I think there's a lot of excitement in the space, but perhaps one of the areas that we don't talk about as much is kind of on the other side, the private sector, the commercial side, where some of these high-value credentials that will get issued from the public sector become kind of inputs for the private sector to ingest and then to use within their own data ecosystems. And so kind of the purpose of the conversation today is just to explore more that other side, that commercial side. What are some of the differences there? What are some of the foundational pieces that need to be put into place for these new data ecosystems based on verifiable credentials to thrive? And so maybe a good starting point, and throughout this conversation, I'll just, unless I call out, I'll shoot it to both of you and feel free to jump in as you wish. Maybe one of the areas that is worth starting on is just, we often talk about digital trust being kind of a good framing around the space that we're in. I think there's some key differences in how trust is perceived or defined by organizations versus individuals. Maybe the whole concept of digital trust is more something that applies to individuals versus organizations. So maybe we could kind of start there to just better understand how all these concepts of digital trust and just trust altogether apply or don't apply. What are some differences maybe with how trust is achieved by organizations, either organizations to organization relationships or organizations to people relationships?
Let's start with the hot topic. I think this is really easy to approach from the EU digital identity perspective. And when you look at the EIDAS and the EU digital identity in general, it seems that it's relatively straightforward. Hey, we have governments and the European Union stating that here are credentials that you need to accept in certain sectors, let's say banking and finance sector. But the challenge is that the same time when governments are trying to state that you must accept these strong authentication credentials, for example, they're not giving any reliabilities. So how does an organization like a bank can get any kind of business guarantees, financial guarantees that these are actually not fraud? And that's really a problem. It's not for them. The point is not really necessarily that can I trust this, but it's more about how high liabilities will this credential cover actually. So what will I be able to, what should I, and what's the risk factor for offering services in exchange for this credential, in exchange for the trust? And you would think that this being European Union and this being the member states of EU, national registry, etc., that would be the highest level of trust that you would have, and very likely it is. But there's always the risk that something happens, and that's really the viewpoint from organizations' perspective. That's it's not if it's the fan, it's when it will happen, and when it happens, who covers the liabilities? And I think that is a big problem or challenge actually in any kind of decentralized system, decentralized network, is that what is the liability chain aside from the trust chain itself? So I think that is a huge factor that organizations are constantly reviewing. And I see that's one of those things that really currently make and break these kind of decentralized projects as well, is that we don't necessarily tackle that liability factor well enough.
I think there is the liability chain is good example on how the whole trust is quite complex systemic issue, and there is a lot of different perspectives. I think that the sort of individual perspective on trust and the organization corporate perspective, there are definitely differences, but I would expect that, when we get an ecosystem functioning, the building blocks which can be used for building that trust in the ecosystem, same building blocks may apply both on the individual and organizational side. So I think that the systemic effects spread across, but it's not really division only on the sort of individual versus organization. But I think that equally we see, well, for example, I've been working in one big retail company in Finland, so we have regular annual surveys on how our customers, our loyalty members, how they perceive us. Are we trustworthy for them in terms of how we manage the sort of their data and so on. There's a wide range on how people perceive us. So some of them are very skeptical, but luckily still most of the individuals, they trust in us. But it's like when you go deeper and start analyzing and asking why, that sort of perception and sort of preferences, why somebody is, why an organization is trustworthy, it varies a lot. So fundamentally, it's not really a single factor or single element that can solve the trust equation, but it's a combination of sort of things, whether they are technical or organizational, that ultimately make our practices, makes our society, make our infrastructure trustworthy. And we see that also in different cultures. Like I guess in Finland we have a little bit even naive perspective sometimes on trust, because we live in a society which that the sort of trust is sort of spread across. Like we trust on police, we trust on our politicians, we don't have corruption and so on. And that is a sort of feedback loop that spreads around. And I think that when we talk about digital trust and digital trust mechanisms, we need to acknowledge that it's one important component in the sort of spectrum of components that ultimately make our infrastructure, our sort of ecosystems trustworthy. But it may be significant or very sort of crucial at this point when you can really claim that in many digital services or engagements, the trust is broken, especially when we look at it from the customer perspective. So I think there is a problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and isn't it so actually that when you think about it, decentralized trust or any kind of digital trust, actually, it is always based on forming these kind of trustworthy connections and trustworthy liabilities, whether it's evaluating and receiving those that like the example I gave earlier, but the other way around as well. So when let's say the bank again forms a customer relationship with their customers, that is a form of commitment. And if they will be proving something about this person, like we would assume that the wallet ecosystem would have these kind of relationships, that is a liability commitment. So if you consider the EU case again, the question of can I trust this person is actually just the starting point. So it's just the first cornerstone of the relationship, and then the other cornerstones are built from there on. And once the liabilities and risk factors are considered to be good enough, then the bank can start to issue claims and credentials and start to build new kinds of liability chains. But that's, if you think about it, that's again based completely on their own estimation of the risks and liabilities that have to do with this person. So that's really, I think, when you consider any kind of wallet ecosystems or data spaces, that's where it starts from. Because I think the bank example is good because that is so highly the most highly regulated sectors that we have. So it kind of reveals the false assumptions we may have. It also reveals that there's a lot of interest from that space, and there's a lot of need for that. But due to, let's say, what we're seeing in blockchains or wallets, there's a lot of interest, but we're not seeing tremendous amounts of banks taking that digital identity and starting to run with it. There's a lot of interest, but not that much in production. And I think that's an indication that we just haven't solved the critical part. And that's really where I think that we are currently doing a lot of great stuff. So I think the next part of development is not technical, that we're going to be seeing, that the breakthroughs that we need are technical, but more part of the governance and liability chain and how to tie in that with those transactions and interactions and then maybe even moving that to larger spaces like the data spaces that we're seeing. Kai, you know a lot of that area. That how would data spaces which build their own rules for their own group, how can we sort of input those wallets and those liability chains and trust, and maybe even bridge the gap towards that? So I think that's really an interesting area.
I would say so, even that, when you look at the data spaces, the whole point of data space is to create digital service ecosystems which are not platforms. They are not centralized, platforms where single entity can control the whole chain and sort of be the sort of also the anchor for creating trust. But the whole idea is that they are networked. They are in some level. They are not radically necessarily distributed. There is forms of governance, and there's a form of agreements between entities, but it is distributed. It's a network approach. And in that kind of network approach, as data spaces are, you need to have a distributed approach on trust also. And you then also the liability chain, how you solve that. I think that in data spaces, interesting idea is how you can, how do you use the governance of the data spaces also to support the liability chain?
Yeah, isn't it so? This is, and I don't know data spaces that well myself, but isn't it so that many of the data spaces are really strong in developing their governance or their playbook, and then they may have really bespoke technical solutions like APIs that they agree on that this is how it works, and they're not necessarily using that so generic technical platforms there.
Honestly and practically, at the moment with data spaces, we are in a situation where sort of the success stories and the real operational cases of data spaces are in the B2B domain, and they have been built on relatively sort of established technology. But the big part and the sort of focus in how they form, how they operate is in understanding the sort of governance and understanding on how the sort of common business arrangement functions. Well, that is the sort of reality at this point. There's the sort of rule of thumb that 80% of design in data space is about designing governance, and 20% or less is about technology. Clearly, we are seeing the sort of shift towards how the databases can function in also sort of personal data context, and also how to apply wallet approach and more distributed technologies there. But that's like the big work that is ongoing. But practically, none of the big good examples about data spaces haven't utilized that technology yet. But there's a lot of emphasis on exploring.
Is a data space then like kind of a new type of role within this digital ecosystem, where perhaps like some of the risk or liabilities we're talking about could be covered or can be shared within these areas? And it almost makes me think of like what a trust registry is to some extent when we're talking about data spaces. Like how are all these things related or not?
I think that in many ways, sort of that trust registry and different kind of registry functions and data spaces, they are perhaps conceptually in a different level, but clearly, when you look at it in practice, the ideas and the purpose why we've been focusing on these things might not be that different. Data spaces the concept has sort of history in industrial databases and industrial collaboration, how that can be realized with the digital means, but now the sort of that idea and that concept has been spreading and getting a momentum through the interest on really finding new approaches in the European digital strategy. So I think that's one reason why we are like, when you look at the data space and the concept and why it's so important at the moment, especially in Europe, big part comes from the sort of European digital strategy.
You mentioned maybe it's based on some more industrial models. Like what are some models of data spaces that have maybe a data space we're talking about? It's a bit of a different implementation, but it achieves the same thing. Like, are there some historical examples of these types of organizations that have served similar purposes for different ecosystems?
So the few best examples of data spaces that often applied. They are in the supply chain data. So how do you connect different ERP systems, and how the sort of data can be shared about the inventories, and how do you get sort of how do you do purchasing and order management through your supply chain? Those are often cases that are quite practical and often used in the data space context. Then again, similar development, which you might call data spaces, but the technical approach is a little bit different. We have, for example, in Finland, we have X-Road, for example, which is a sort of service bus concept that's been applied for sharing data across different government institutes. It's also it's actually derived from the European X-Road concept. So, Estonian X-Road. So in some sense, you could call X-Road also a data space. Then again, in product data exchange, you have at the GS1 organization. So it is a little bit more simpler and centralized model in how the data is being exchanged. But I think that when you look at GS1 also, big part and big focus is not about technology. It's about how you govern the GS1 as an entity. So GS1 is the governance entity for product data exchange among retail. So I think you have multiple good examples about how the same thing is sort of really developing governance entities and governance structures for data exchange have existed, and how they have been successful, and now with the new technology and with the digitalized society, need for this kind of data exchange is just getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I think that's a really great interface to what's being talked in Europe and all over the world. Actually, one of the hot topics in my mind is the organization digital identities as well, which is also a part of the European Union digital identity programs, especially worked in the European Union, the Wallet Consortium, EWC, large-scale pilots. And when I think about the use of organization digital identities, it's exactly the data space. You mentioned, Kai, the supply chains, which is a really good example. In my mind, and again, I'm not a professional in the data space sphere, so I can't vouch for this. But in my mind, the challenge there has a lot to do with scalability. And by scalability, I mean that the ability to achieve trust within traditional data spaces where you have ERPs and you will have bespoke created APIs, and you may have process designed especially for that data space and technologies designed for that data space, that actually starts to hinder the scalability of those data spaces. And what I see that decentralized identity in my mind could bring to the table is a true B2B trusted connectivity. So we've been talking a lot about the internet missing the layer of trust. And that's what Trust over IP wants to achieve. And I think there's really great projects. I think Bosch is one of those organizations that has been doing work on, I think they're calling it the business partner agent. And I think that's a good example on, I believe it's master data related, that how do you do business to business connectivity that has a layer of a native layer of trust, and that can use any type of protocols to exchange that data. So instead of only relying on, let's say, OAuth-based API connections, you would be able to have connections between n number of organizations and have a co-protocol or business protocol that is able to understand that, hey, this process includes multiple organizations, and the data needs to be exchanged from one party to all of these three parties, and they all need to acknowledge that the process has went through nicely, and everything is accepted and according to the process. So we'll be having a lot more complex value chains as well. And this, again, this ties in very well with the governance, with the trust registries. And in this case, the trust registry is more about an interface towards authentic sources or authentic data sources within that ecosystem. So it's not only about, let's say, some people may understand trust registry as what we had ledgers or blockchains in early days, where you would have a trust registry would be a storage for keys. So we're not talking about that, but more about, is this party, are they currently active member of this ecosystem that I'm trusting? So I think that's where we're, I see that the convergence comes in, is that we're exploring the organizational digital identities, also about how can these organizational agents discuss with each other, exchange that data, and how can they define the explicit governance requirements that are happening within that transaction. Because when you start to drill down to, you said GS1, a huge ecosystem, global ecosystems. Glyph is another one with global spread. We're going to be seeing a lot more of these transactions happening where we need to establish dynamically what is the governance of that is applied within this transaction. What are the parties that are involved in this transaction? Are all the parties in this transaction actually organizations that have accepted these terms that are part of this governance that we're dealing with? So that's where we start to see the true complexity and usefulness. I think that's where we're going to see a huge number of not only optimal risk mitigations, but as well just cost efficiencies happening, that we can start to execute on much more higher level of trust these kinds of transactions, B2B transactions, and have that available. So obviously there's much more complexity than that, but I see that as a fascinating space, and I really truly hope that we're going to be moving to that much more.
Yeah, it's like the cost of agreeing, cost of building a sort of collaboration, for example, bilaterally, versus building it in a sort of data space like governed ecosystem. That's one really business case for data spaces, and that's what we've been talking about already, and seeing the sort of benefit on really the sort of going through the legal process and business agreement process bilaterally in order to achieve sort of control, sort of legal control, even not to speak about the technical control across your value chain, for example, might be really high. Whereas if you can build in a sort of data space with the, we call it like rule book, Citra rule book, for example, as a template on how do you do this kind of mutual agreement within the data space for data sharing. So these are the building blocks and the templates that can help you to really optimize the agreement process and make it cheaper to start collaborating. And this should be a major driver for this kind of data spaces.
When we're talking about liability here, we're talking about a need for dynamic liability. Like, I'm not a risk professional by no means, but if I take, and I know we're talking about a lot of B2B type of scenarios here, but in a B2C scenario, and just using a real world example, and we use this example a lot, like we take our driver's license with us when we want to get a rental car, and we show our physical driver's license to the rental car company, and then they'll maybe take a second piece of ID and allow us to get a car or not. Or other types of relying parties that rely on government issued IDs, like driver's license, could be a bank if they want to open up a bank account. And often nowadays there's these intermediary services that will do a document authentication and a biometric. Basically, everyone's kind of done that now. Scan your driver's license with your phone and move on from there. But in both of these cases, like, I'm assuming the transportation ministry that issued the driver's license is not going to take liability if something happens with the physical driver's license, just like the document authentication scanning company probably won't take liability if something happens on the verification of that. I'm not sure. But why is it so different in this digital space here, where liability becomes that much more important? Because in these two examples I gave, unless I'm wrong, I'm not sure that the issuing authority or the party attesting to the authenticity of a document necessarily takes liability if something goes wrong.
Yeah, I think you hit the spot exactly there. It would be really great to have somebody from finance industry just to explain that process thoroughly, because I believe that is really one of those big places where why we've seen a lot of these document or ID scanning services become really, really important, because that streamlines the operation of checking that ID. And that's actually a really heavy in terms of operating costs just to run that, if let's say a bank would want to run that by themselves. And I can't say for any of the contracts or how organizations actually handle these, but that's really a crucial liability point. And I think that is also one of those places that's, when we think of earlier days, fun to say earlier days now, but at least I remember one of the white papers that Sovereign Foundation, one of the first ones that they sent out, there was a use case where they described something called an insurer. And I think the use case was something like this: that's an organization that has a process to verify that a credential is a valid credential and it has been issued to a valid person, that they would be part of that process somehow. And then they would be able to issue some level of proof or liabilities in the presentation phase. So they would be an insurer for the relying party that, hey, this is a valid credential, and I'm trusting my process enough that I'm willing to give you some level of liabilities, let's say up to $10,000 or something like that. So that is a type of mitigating factor for risk and liabilities. But that is definitely one of those things that why many times, even if you would have automated verification of documents and identity documents, you would be able to still want to have a manual checkup of some sorts. And that really has to do with the factor of confidentiality, or the confidence factor. That's how confident are we that this is not a fraudulent document. But again, that's an area that goes in somewhere that I'm not proficient in terms of what is the confidence or liability factors that these kinds of organizations can give. But it's right there. I think it's right there in the critical space. And that's why it's been really popular for the past years that we're seeing organizations coming up with those kinds of services. And we were just seeing that that's really important and needed.
I think that sort of the digital identity, the data in general, it's becoming a critical piece in our business processes, and we're building on relying the fact that the data is right in more and more cases, and then we have like the data processor also has liabilities when they are processing data. We just heard about the big fine that Meta was the sort of record-breaking fine that now Meta was imposed by European Commission on infringement on GDPR, and sort of more and more the data that corporations are sort of having in their core business processes are actually sort of processed by some other company, for example, sort of as a service, and they are sort of this is not exactly about the same as the liability chain, but I think that there's an analogy here that when you're doing the data processing agreements with these service providers, you of course agree on the liabilities that, you know, if you do like GDPR infringements in your operations, me as a data controller, I have to pay it anyways because I'm responsible of you. And now, so we need to have this chain of activity here. So you are actually factually processing the data, but I'm the controller and I'm liable, but you are also liable through the data processing agreement. So in some sense, this shows the sort of critical activities around the data, and the same applies also when we talk about the verified credentials. That when you are building something that is so operational critical, you need to rely on that. Okay, the data that I'm getting is really right, and of course, what we don't see that much yet, and when it comes only in the commercial activity more, and I think we are struggling, is that nobody sort of commits to sort of is agreeing on any sort of so you need to have a contractual framework in order to actually realize this liability, and the other party who is using that data, who is using that verified credentials, needs to pay for using that thing, because otherwise nobody is like providing verified data for free and taking then also the liability on how it's been used. Like, that kind of equation usually doesn't work. So there needs to be the business agreement also, and then the sort of contractual governance framework on top of that in order to hold change function, I think.
Yeah. Hey, this goes to really interesting again. Guy, you and I wrote a blog post regarding wallet wars, or what we call not wallet wars, but ecosystem wars. And that's, I think, where when we complement this with, let's say, the Googles and Apples, the GAFAMs, and what we're seeing there, that's what they're doing is that they're building ecosystems where they are the solar center. And what they're doing, let's say with Apple Pay, is that they're handling the liability and risk. They're stating to everybody that, hey, we are vetting these people. They're going to come with our phones and they're going to present you with credentials that are coming from our wallets, and that's why you can trust it. And that's a huge business proposition for any small business that wants to get access or needs to have those levels of any kind of levels of liabilities, risk, credentials, whatnot, to be handled. So you can imagine that how really favorable that would be for Google and Apple. And we've seen the same thing happen in other sectors where they've been, and they've been bringing these really interesting products onto the market that will help people's lives, and then they're offering it to the organizations that, hey, this is a way for you to get access to this much new customers, and that's really great from the customer's perspective. The problem becomes that when they're really centric to these huge organizations, everything is going to be driving through their systems. And I think wallets are a prime example that if digital identities and wallets start to be used only through their ecosystems, like Apple has deals with some US states for driver's licenses, and wait for a small while, we're going to see Apple wallets with loyalty systems. So in every transaction you're making, you're going to be passing it through the Apple system. The data that they're gathering, they're getting it and they're using it to build much more. And that is really critical to understand. That's one of the risk factors that they're taking, is that they're saying that we're taking the risk. Obviously, they're going to be somehow handling it in the business transactions purchases, and they have those contracts with the relying parties and and their partners. But still, that's a game that they're playing very well. And that's when we contrast that with what EU is doing. EU is doing that with government registries, and that's a really good one too. But then the problem there is that how do we make business? So they have a different type of problem to handle. And then we have the data spaces, which is as a third one that we just spoke, where we have really great potential for any kind of independent wallets to be building that liability risk factor through open wallets. And that's, again, a different way to do that in that ecosystem perspective. So again, we're seeing the same thing, is that we're seeing the battle of centralized platforms that are now contrasted as well with governments, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but more about where we need to find that golden route, and how will wallets and identities work in all of this, and how do we ensure that that is not something that Apples and Googles and others are not going to be controlling our identity as well so much, that we can get much more openness in that.
I guess in the traditional business world, like liability is managed through legal relationships with other legal entities, right? Whether it's like a document authentication company or it's a business partner of yours, you have a legal relationship with them, versus the potential in this kind of open ecosystem space is you could have B2B interactions that don't necessitate necessarily a legal relationship between the two parties to be able to leverage data from each other, which seems like a big positive when it comes to just being more agile and scaling certain things. I don't need to have like this long setup with another company to be able to work with them. I could just kind of hop on and trust what's being shared with me. But then that definitely brings, I guess, if liability is protected today through legal relationships, and you don't necessarily have a legal relationship anymore with the direct parties, do you need to have a legal relationship with the data space or the ecosystem, or not sure how that works?
Well, yeah, I think that we are all working on that, and I think that's the hypothesis with data spaces that it's shown in a certain context already. How it can function, that instead of focusing on bilateral business agreements, you build on the ecosystem level agreement framework, what they call it's a soft infrastructure in that sense. So but it's not only technical, but it's also sort of legal component. But it's definitely a new way of thinking on how you do the legal agreement. So switching from the bilateral setup. I think that in past we've seen, for example, in the payments context of the banking finance, you see the banks and how they operate in more network fashion. You have the certain sort of interoperability mechanisms in between them, but it's quite scalable model and it's becoming infrastructure. Then again, we see the credit card frameworks, which are more like platforms. You have few of them, they are quite competing, but they are closed systems. But again, they are actually providing quite a lot of trust in a sort of in their centralized system, which is quite analogous to what Apple and Google are now capable of doing with their wallet approach. So I think this kind of network and how they function, and then the platform centralized model, how they function, they have quite different pros and cons. And now the big question is that is the next phase because of the scalability, because of certain sort of challenges that the platforms and centralized entities impose into the society, is the next phase a network again in when it comes to digital infrastructure. So the Web3 is of course one question, but Web3 goes to a quite extreme in sort of distributed and network approach. So do we find more balanced approach there with sort of with some level of governance, but still the scalability and benefits of the network?
Something that came into my mind was that have we explored enough sort of the sweet spots of these data ecosystems? When you consider, we've been talking now about liabilities a lot, and obviously the liabilities are not fixed. It's not the same for like strong authentication or just presenting your loyalty card. So there are certain liabilities there, but others have much less damage that you can cause if that's broken. So really the question is that what are really the sweet spots for digital credentials? That we've been talking a lot about the use cases. The strong authentications comes, and the driver's license are really the strong ones that really have the need for high liabilities, high risk factors, high assurance levels. But is there, again, when we talk about data spaces, then there's other types of data. Because you have a lot of IPR protected data. So, but you still have the need for authenticity and integrity. For example, let's say digital product passports. So those are going to be, in EU is working on this regulation. So digital product passport is something that's going to be coming to multiple sectors, for example, to batteries and textile, etc. So you need to have that kind of assurance that there is data, that this data that we're seeing comes from an authentic source and it represents the data of this exact product. And there may be data there that is probably not in that credential, but there may be references to data that are IPR protected. So that's, again, a different type of liability, that we need some information that is valuable to the ecosystem, but we don't want to reveal that information because that is IPR protected. And obviously not everyone wants to reveal that because that would be harmful for their business. So we're seeing that there may be actually different types of sweet spots for data for different ecosystems, and not all necessarily have the same level of liabilities and risks that they want to manage. But then again, some like lower level use cases, you may have so simple use cases that it's not necessarily even worth it to create those kinds of, let's say, library card is something that you would use probably a lot if you use a lot of libraries, but what's the benefit for the library to actually move on to digital wallets? It may not actually be that beneficial, so it may be just simple enough to stay in that paper card or plastic card. So I think that's something to find, is the sweet spot of getting that benefit out of using digital credentials and out of using the authenticity and integrity that you get out of this digital version of verifiable credentials. That is something just came into my mind when I was listening.
It's more of if we're talking about risk, it's just how do you get enough reward, and then there's enough shared risk that people will want to, or organizations will want to switch over and feel comfortable engaging in the new model. Switching topics a little bit, but still staying kind of under the same umbrella under commercial data ecosystems being formed. So we've been talking a lot about liability here in this conversation so far. I guess one of the pieces of writings or papers that I found personally very interesting when I first got into the digital identity space were a set of blog posts or writings from Doc Searles on vendor relationship management. And found it quite fascinating to just see that, yeah, you know what, like the way that organizations look at prospect customers, well, you could kind of flip that paradigm around, and as a consumer, you could kind of have that same type of interaction where vendors could be bidding for your services basically, and by owning your own data and being able to access personalization and stuff like that, like you could manage your possible vendors through this similar type of scenario. And I know, Kai, when I was reading the MyData declaration, there seems to be a lot of similarities between some of the points in the MyData declaration and a lot of the stuff that was written by Doc Searles in the vendor relationship management texts. And so it would be interesting just to hear kind of why that was kind of an important one for MyData as well, and how it all kind of relates back to this conversation of creating commercial data ecosystems.
Yeah, when we started with MyData, we didn't know about the BRM at that point, but when we started like looking around and especially going up beyond Finland, we ran it quite quickly and find a major connection with the idea. So we've been at one point we bought the intention economy book for everybody in our group, just to like make sure that everybody knows the principle, and we really like the idea a lot, especially like sort of flipping the marketing ecosystem into more human-centric. Yeah, as we know, the BRM really didn't took it as such, so like it didn't really have that market adoption at that time. But I think that the idea is still there. I think there are a lot of people who were inspired, and especially those who have been around for quite some time. It's quite easy to refer that. So I think that it was a powerful idea, and it still resonates. And I think that we just talked about verified credentials, but if you think about the power of wallets and also the data that you can self-claim and the credentials that are not necessarily verified, but are still valuable. So I think that there is the sort of the tools and technologies that we are approaching with the wallets and data spaces. They might be well adapted in actually to realize the VRM ideas. I think we are clearly, like, at the same time, the concept of CRM, the customer relationship management, is evolving. It's coming. There's the pressure, sort of how to have a really high quality data in your customer databases. It's been there for ages, but it's now becoming more and more important that then we are connecting to the verified credentials. So one way of making the sort of the data in your customer databases better is to apply digital wallet for identification and get those credentials at the same time. So update them, test these things. But then when you look at it, if you build that kind of function in your commercial ecosystem, why wouldn't you expand your sort of credential exchange with your preference information or different kind of intent casting ideas? So definitely, I think that we are getting those components sort of with the new technology that actually quite automatically might help us to build PRM-related use cases and scenarios. And we clearly, like in both sides, in the marketing context and the corporation context, as well as in the individual side, we need some kind of flip into the ways how not only marketing, but the whole sort of customer engagement and customer services are realized. So yeah, I think that's my personal bet. It's time to reintroduce VRM in our thinking, and I have one evidence for that, like why this is becoming important. There in the marketing context, there is quite a lot of talking about zero-party data. So zero-party data means data that people produce by themselves about themselves. So if I type into different kind of e-commerce services my preference information, that is considered as zero-party data. I think that the name is awful. So how come that is zero-party data? Because I'm the first person. So why? But the history goes that the first-party data is the organization's data about me. So I think there was something went wrong in the naming in this marketing context. But anyway, so now there's a lot of talk about zero-party data, and in essence, zero-party data is already the step one in the VRM. And yeah, so my thinking is that if we would have a data space on sort of customer relationship or marketing, that would essentially be something that is quite close to the VRM thinking already.
I think that's definitely the evolution where we're going towards. And we're seeing that already in customer behavior, or actually, I think consumer behavior is the wrong word, maybe individual behavior in general, when you look at social media. So we're becoming much more used to defining our audience. When you think about, I have teenagers I have two teens, and third one is becoming one. So I know that I'm not seeing all the content that they're sharing for their friends. So they have their own audiences, their visibility groups that they're using, and they're saying that these are my close friends and families, that they're seeing one thing. These are the ones that are seeing something else. So the behavior of defining relationship groups is already there. We are becoming much more used to that kind of thing. And that is partially also, and we're actually the other way around as well. We are defining in news sites or any kind of social media also our interest topics. Whether it's in Twitter or somewhere else, we're just stating these are the topics I'm interested in. So we're filtering out the content. And so we're becoming much more used to handling the mass of information and mass of connections with different kinds of groupings and audiences. And I think that is going to be, when we combine that with wallets, and or any other type of interface that we may have. And then with the ability to form connections. And that's one thing that I'm advocating, is that the next step is not to use wallets like we use our browsers, that we just go to a website and sign in and that's a session, and then we come out and that session is gone, but more about forming those persistent connections. And there we can start to establish the skills we've learned when using social media and applying it in the VRM sense, that we're starting to define that these are my trusted brands or the ones I'm interested in. These are the topics I'm interested in. And then we're starting to see this much more organic data space to happen. So again, fascinating.
Yeah, it's just like I'm so happy that you mentioned this relationship. So I think that we really should focus on solving the relationship management, sort of really balanced CRM plus VRM, so both sides, balanced relationship management ecosystem. And I think that the wallets and credentials are the building blocks for it. But we're talking a lot about identity, and we're talking a lot about the data and credentials. But ultimately, how about if we start talking about relationship and relationship management? It would make, in many ways, much more sense for organizations, because it's really like, if you look at the currently, like, for example, where is the sort of data credentials, where they are managed, where the whole consents and all the permissions are managed? They are in the CRM systems currently. And it's really, and what is the big pain with individuals, especially when we are moving in the society where we are not really buying products, but we are buying services. It's not really of really having individual encounters and just single instances and so on, but it's really about having relationships with your service providers and how do you manage that. So essentially, we should build really the conceptual framing on how we are building the sort of trusted ecosystem, commercial ecosystem on top of wallets. Our claim at the moment is that it should be more focusing on the relationship context. And that also gives a little bit new flavor on the trust issue, because it's not trust on data, but it's trust on relationship.
Typically at the top of the funnel for an organization that is really looking at marketing through their CRM, like there's no, I guess you could say there's a bunch of connections, because there's kind of one way reaching out to try to attract the potential customer, but there's not necessarily a relationship. So does this allow us to kind of move the relationships earlier in the cycle, so that even when you're at the top of the funnel, when you're doing marketing, when you're early engaging with prospects, you could start developing relationships, versus today, relationships tend to be more built once customer acquisition or whatever contract between the two has happened? Does this allow for relationships without contract, I guess?
Yeah, I think that this phase is when you are converting the lead or the sort of prospect into your customer. We might see a little more phases and more nuanced sort of steps in that ladder. But yet again, I don't think that perhaps the marketing is a wrong sort of connotation. Like, it depends on who you talk about, how people perceive marketing. But for example, the retail company that I've been working on, it's like, first of all, in their customer system, they have 75% of the Finnish population. So it's not like, the number of prospects is marginal in the Finnish markets in contrast to the people who are already in the loyalty frame. And a big part of the communication, so it's marketing, and also the credential access, you can think about that as an individual to organization communication, and it should be more interactive, and it could be more interactive with the current methods we have. And it's like, I just had a talk with a friend who used to be working with Facebook and has been going around, but came back to Finland. And he said, okay, but I'm still using a sort of, I know how the cookies work, and I know how the digital marketing works. So if I see something interesting, I purposefully sort of navigate a little bit in that website just to make sure that they start doing retargeting, so that it's almost like doing a bookmarking there. But it's sort of that just shows that, okay, people have sort of this algorithmic sense and then how the whole thing is interacting. And actually, with Antti, we have been sort of exploring this idea on how you could do more trusted sort of marketing in media sites by using your relationship CRM data, basically. This is already what is happening at the moment, that when the cookies are fading away for multiple reasons, like whether we are talking about Facebook or Meta or Google network. So you can use your first party data or your CRM data to do the targeting in these social media networks or even the sort of traditional media networks. And this is like blurring the border between like what is the part of the sort of relationship management at the sort of established relations and what is the part of the marketing domain. So I think that if you would get more trusted and balanced ecosystem on sort of seeing that the CRM system is not isolated corporate internal mechanism only, but it's more like network component or node in the sort of network relationship management ecosystem. We might see much more nuance on like, how people are partially and gradually disclosing their identity, how they might use their persistent identity and profile in even like sort of exploration phase with the sort of potential candidates who might be sort of targeting to them, and also one sort of scenario which is sort of derived from the vendor relationship management thinking is this idea of life events. So if you're something major is happening in your life, you get for example, a baby, or you exchange jobs or go to study or so on. So these are major life events, and now how the sort of verified credentials and VRM and these like new marketing systems might come together is that your school is providing credentials that now you are a student. But you are not just using this to disclose that you can get the student discount, but you are actually using this as a sort of vehicle to say that I have now this major life event, and you are intent casting that across different kind of service encounters, and they understand, okay, this is a major thing for this person. So let's adjust our communication around that need and that major life event that this individual has. And now this is the way how to sort of really the credentials, verified credentials, intent casting and new ways of doing trusted marketing and seeing marketing as more like a service comes together.
Yeah, and technically that is something that kind of relationship management is something we have not had tools for that. And if you look at trust over IP, for example, those are the types of tools that we're building there, or the specifications we're building in trust over IP, where you need something like trust spanning protocol. You need something more than the protocols we have today to manage these kind of connections. We need identifiers, because identity is basically about managing your identifiers. And what are these kinds of, let's say, marketing relationships, whether they are between one person, one organization, or one person and 5 organizations, that's a context that we are managing. And that kind of context may be managed through something like decentralized identifiers. So we're seeing the tools that we need, actually, that we have those available. And if you think about then those different use cases, we need different types of tasks around those. So whether it's something like advertising or me establishing a trusted link between another organization or receiving some kind of advertisement. So those are trust tasks, essentially. And why we're needing those is that because currently the power of maintaining and establishing that relationship is only on the organization side. I have the legal capability of saying that I don't want this anymore, but that's it. That's why we needed GDPR and other types of legal recourse to say that I don't want to receive this kind of personalization anymore. But that's not that useful, actually. So what I would more need is that I want to have that also technical capability to handle that power to handle that relationship. And then once we start to build and make that much more user friendly, it becomes again much more interesting for people to manage when it becomes similar to, let's say, social media, to just stating that in intent cast way that, hey, I'm right now looking for new sports equipment. I've started to do badminton and stuff like that. So I'm more open to offers on that area. So maybe not a major life event, but something like, hey, I'm a middle-aged man. I want to get fit. So please hit me up. So, but that's fun, I think.
Yeah, I like the reference to trust tasks, like stuff just negotiating the terms and conditions or just broadcasting to a network is stuff that is just not possible today. And I think I like the mention of the trust spanning protocol, because you guys are right. Like it's always just, it's the organization to the consumer, or it's the server towards the client that has all the power in relationships today. And so being able to flip that now kind of, I guess, would help live some of the provinces of the vendor relationship management concepts. And I guess for a marketing standpoint, I think the term you had used in our previous discussion, Kai, is just trust-based marketing, which is nice.
Yeah, I think there's need all around to do that flipping, that, you know, moving from the surveillance capitalism towards trust-based marketing.
Yeah, so I guess the last question then, and we may have covered this a little bit throughout the discussion, but just to make it a little bit more clear. So we're, again, to repeat, there seems to be a lot of focus on government digital identity or digital credentialing, however we want to market this stuff now. Digital identity has become a bad term recently in government programs, but governments can't provide these data ecosystem solutions for commercial use cases. So how do we go about incubating and developing these new data ecosystems? What are the types of organizations and structures? We talked about GS1 being kind of a good example, but what would be some recommendations on how to approach forming, I guess, governance bodies for data ecosystems?
Yeah, I think that the governance question is really essential, and but that really should be more like the solution. But the governance entity and the governance design is still not the starting, but we should first really look into like who are the entities in the ecosystem. And one big question and sort of hypothesis also in MyData has been the role of intermediaries. And this is a little bit, I don't know, controversial, but somewhat sort of an issue that we need to probably work with when it comes to wallets. Since if you think about wallets, they are not really intermediaries; they are not really services as such. So now there will be new legislation in EU called Digital Governance Act, which is establishing the intermediary concept, so the data intermediary, and this kind of personal data intermediary may be an essential role in the new sort of data spaces and also potentially this kind of commercial ecosystems building on top of the government sort of frameworks like the EU digital wallets. We have had this name for the personal data intermediaries in MyData called MyData operators, and the idea is that this is really the service provider is just there for individuals to make them capable of empowering their data use and their sort of connection to the ecosystems and also controlling their own privacy and so on. And throughout the years, we have been exploring like how the different companies and technical approaches can apply this kind of intermediary role. And earlier there were different approaches. There's a lot of talk about personal data storages, and now the solid pods and solid is becoming quite big on that thing. But more and more our sort of personal data intermediary companies that are in the network sort of community of MyData, they are looking into wallets and are building also around the wallet concept. But it's not only a wallet, but it's the wallet plus something. So the wallet and the service around it. And how wallet and personal data storage, for example, comes together, and how the wallet and the wallet provider comes together as a service entity, as a intermediary, which has an established role in the this kind of personal data ecosystem, is very important and interesting question. It's also a question about liability and sort of really sort of how the trust is forming and on. How do you perceive the whole ecosystem? You're not perceiving only through the wallet and the sort of technical capability, but you have your service provider who is the sort of lens towards this ecosystem in that mechanism. And now the big challenge for us in sort of bootstrapping and building on this ecosystem development and the sort of collaborations we have, for example, in MyData, is the question on how can we make the business of having this kind of providing these personal data intermediary services commercially viable, because the practical reality is that individuals won't pay at the moment for these kind of services, especially like when you have Apple and Google providing the service for free. So the ecosystem needs to set up on how these kind of intermediaries get revenue, and needs to come from the corporate side. And now the current challenge that what we've seen already with the pilots and projects that these our MyData operators are having is that when MyData operator is going into the sort of mode of having both organizations as partners and then providing service for individuals, they are basically positioning themselves as a platform, because they are, two sides are connected to them. So now the latest thing that what we have been exploring is the separation of concerns of having the two different entities, two different intermediaries, one for the organizational side and one for the individual side, and how they connect together and how they are the entities and really the core members in the governance framework, sort of providing the infrastructure for the ecosystem to function. And they would be also the connection providers and the providers for the organization side. And that is also the thing that what we've seen in established this kind of data spaces that I talked earlier. So in those cases, usually you have a service provider who is actually providing the connection. The companies are not really doing it by themselves directly, but they have some kind of trusted partner that they're relying on. Whether it's certified as a sort of European data governance act certified data intermediary or not is again a very important question, because that's really a new established legal role with responsibilities, but also rights in that sense. But yeah, so I think that, in steps of moving forward, I think that, we need to really solve this issue on how the wallets and intermediaries come together and how the intermediaries have a viable business position in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and from business perspective, I would say that it's quite similar to, let's say, startup platform founders who are thinking about how do I create this next unicorn. It comes really down to the fundamentals of the business of, in this case, relying parties. So we're now seeing that we are going to be having a tremendous amount of credentials coming from EU, from other nations, and but the real question is that who uses it, and what is the value that we're going to be realizing, and that's really the question. Is that we have this decades of experience in internet and digitalization in general. So the question is that what is the fundamental value we're creating for the relying parties? And once we solve that, we can solve that the same way for data ecosystems or data spaces as we've done for platforms. It's just a different way of solving the value chain equation. So instead of now needing to figure out the whole value chain, and we just need to figure out that how do I transform this data that I get from the original authentic data source to that value that this relying party needs. And that may take a couple steps. It may be direct, but I would guess that a lot of the innovation for setting up these data spaces and ecosystems starts from there, that we realize that fundamental value, we find out that there are more that need the same value and they are very interested in it. And then the value of the governance comes really, that's not everybody needs to set that up by themselves, but we can just create this governance for this ecosystem, and then different types of service providers come in to bridge that gap. So I think it really comes down to the very basic fundamentals, that what is the actual true value that we're going to be creating for those relying parties, and what is the most efficient way to create that value chain that also includes the liability chain and also has that high enough trust and assurance for that data. So I think that should probably sum it up.
And it's interesting to think like the incentives to do so could definitely see it within existing industry ecosystems. And then if it is true that like consumers will want to have intermediary services working on their behalf and stuff like that, that's a whole other interesting area to understand what would be the incentive for that type of organization to form and want to deploy services.
Yeah, so really we have had this MyData operator concept and a MyData operator award. So we are basically collecting together these kind of services already now. We've been doing for 3 years, and we have had already almost 40 organizations going through the program and getting certified at some point. And through that, we've been sort of collecting a lot of data on how they approach their business and what kind of model they are developing, what kind of technologies they are focusing on. And I think that sort of this position is becoming much more, sort of it's growing all the time, and the idea is growing, and there are more and more use cases coming.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Metzer Glode on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.